walk into this room and say your life is on fire. It's all over the news. I'm feeling sad, can't explain.
I thought I'd talk with you today not so much about finance, but about deference and mystification. I myself am quite perplexed by why Main Street and all of us are so acquiescent in this political season, given the magnitude of what's happening in finance. So I'll briefly describe what I think is happening, proposals for reform, and then talk a little bit more about the obstacles to those reforms. And I just had to put a little music in there because I was jealous of Jennifer Johns seeing those bongos and everything. I mean, when you talk about money, people don't come up and play bongos behind you. In an earlier time, William Jennings Bryan gave his speech about the cross of gold. And the New York World had an editorial. This is an 1896 cartoon. And the controversies were somewhat more tangible regarding finance at that time. In the present time, we have a fundamental issue, which I'll call financial services protectionism. We have a system where institutions are too large to fail, and fear of cascading bankruptcy between them forces our authorities and regulators to back them. The byproduct of that, whether it's through the discount window or Fed bailouts like Bear Stearns or guarantees like Freddie and Fannie that we just saw, is that it anesthetizes credit risk. People that live inside that loop lend money for people who are doing risky things at the wrong price. And without restrictions on the asset side of balance sheets, in other words, limits and controls, they will take excessive risk, and they will build things which we fondly refer to as bubbles. We do this out of some deference to, I don't think all forms of finance need to be referred to as the repackaging of property rights industry, but that's a pretty good approximation for what a lot of what's gone on recently. And there are all kinds of bald assertions which are never measured, never tested, about all of the benefits of finance. In an era when we see developing country money flowing into the largest and wealthiest country in the world, into our risk-free government assets, I think we can question whether or not these benefits can be proven. But we still have to provide this anesthetic because we are hostage to the bailouts. They are too big to fail, and they can take us all down with them. And financiers price that into their decisions as well. How did we get here? We got here because we had an ideology of free markets where everything that was a regulation was viewed as a constraint. A constraint that, if it was removed, was supposedly going to make us all better off. We have very complex credit instruments, which I call the dry leaves, excessive leverage, and when the real estate bubble burst, it was the spark that set it all afire. The Congress and the regulators played a role facilitating this, and campaign contributions certainly played the role as well, which I'll go into. As you can see, finance has done very well. 43% of all corporate profits, when corporate profits as a percentage of GDP, are at an all-time high. Tom Johagan, who's a very colorful lawyer from Chicago, has an article this month in the American Prospect where he went to his law school reunion and he said all of the children of all of his colleagues from law school who did well are working at hedge funds, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley. How are profits made? Just quickly. Profits are equal to profit margin times volume. Volume in finance is leverage. And we create these complex products as financiers in order to give ourselves what you might call an entry barrier to intellectual property rights. The best way I can explain that, as I show you leverage, is the bebop musicians in the 1940s. After the discovery of the recording industry, were very, very angry because they were excellent musicians, but the white guys got all the recording contracts and made all the money. So the bebop musicians went up to Minton's Playhouse in Harlem, Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Max Roach, and Bud Powell, and they made music too complex to be imitated. Well, that's what the financiers are doing too. When I talk about the leverage ratios, they're a product of this system, but they're absolutely off the map, and our society's neck is in a noose as a result. As I said, the bebop music, the complexity creates the profit margins, but complexity, and this is a quote from Emile Henry, who was an assistant secretary of the Treasury in 2006, complexity is sometimes the enemy of stability. It breeds fear in a crisis. The side effect of that fear-generating confusion is not priced by the private sector when left to its own devices. It is a myth that these people are marking to market, and it's a myth that there are broad and deep markets. These are very concentrated institutions, what you'd call an oligopoly, and they mark to model, not to market. And they've all found that out very recently. Credit allocation is very dependent on trust. And when you don't know what's on your own balance sheet, you don't know what's on the next guy's balance sheet, and he asks you to loan to him, you're in the dark. And all these guys are flying in the dark in recent months. And they all admit it to themselves and off the record. Mortgages turned sour. Everybody got scared. Funding costs drove up, and when you got a lot of leverage and your funding costs go up, you got to start selling assets. One guy can sell assets and pull it all back together and raise capital, but the whole system can't do it at the same time. I'll just move along. The major firms all have a lot of positions vis-a-vis each other. They all stare at each other, and they're all trying to get out like an exit in a crowded theater during a fire. The feedback to the real economy actually makes things worse. As they all try to sell things and de-lever, they weaken the economy, which causes the asset quality to deteriorate further, their capital to diminish, and the spiral down continues. Was the Bear Stearns bailout, in my mind, wrong? It might have been done a little more artfully to hurt the stockholders and protect the taxpayers, but it was done in a panic, and at some level, the big winners are all the other banks and counterparties who had reaffirmed the guarantees that everyone was too big to fail, including JP Morgan, who got paid guarantees of $29 billion for the takeover, and they had the largest derivative exposures in Wall Street. They might have gone down with Bear Stearns themselves. They should have been paying for that takeover rather than being paid to help, but that's for another day. Franny and Fetty's bailout is bothersome to me because instead of either just saying, okay, we have kind of a social goal here, and we're going to subsidize these guys, we'll nationalize them, recapitalize them, and the bank will own the upside as well as the downside. We're doing this middle ground stuff right now where the taxpayers get to keep the money. And I agree very much with what Tom said earlier, is these are very important institutions. But the idea that you allow these equity holders to continue while giving more and more strict government guarantees seems to be letting the taxpayer twist in the wind. And people who have argued that you should haircut these bonds, well, I don't know if I can agree with that because all these foreign institutions that hold these things, if we were to default on that conjectural guarantee right now, the United States would have a very difficult time financing itself, and the rest of the world would suffer as well. But that's not because the rules are good, that's because the rules are bad, and we're in a bad situation trying to work ourselves out of it. There's a tremendous coalition of energy right now. I do a lot of work on the Hill, and I used to work with the Senate Banking Committee years ago, trying to avoid doing something. The cost of this is what will cost you $10 billion today will cost you 50 next year and 100 in 2 years. But Wall Street is very, very formidable with their campaign contributions. They do not want to have this fight before the election because cyclically that's when the voters' energy and recourse is the highest. If they can get past the election before they do a major restructuring bailout, then they won't worry as much about having the rules changed in their disfavor. I talk about the basketball analogy of Hank Paulson, the four-corner offense. That's how the University of North Carolina used to pass the ball around and run the clock out without ever shooting. Well, that's what I think he's been up to in recent months. methods of coping, they cut rates, they stimulate fiscal policy, they expand the discount window, they do all kinds of things that are actually spending your money in the future and your children's money more and more. Market fundamentalism has extracted a very, very substantial price. And I say in the last line there, we don't let people smoke in bed or drive drunk. We have to have rules in our society that protect us from the excesses in another corner of society. This is where the deification and deference to finance is very troublesome. We have, as I've heard in earlier speeches today, the heads I win, tails taxpayer loses system, and executive incentives certainly have to be brought under control as well. Inevitably, to clean up the credit allocation process, sometime probably in 2009, we will have a separation between the good and bad assets so that people can get back to a proper credit allocation process. And it will cost the taxpayers money. It will cost them a lot more doing it next year than this year because things will deteriorate between now and then. And here's a laundry list of reforms that might accompany this continued too big to fail system, which I do think we're stuck with. And I'm moving fast here because I want to get on to the next part. You're going to have big fights about the budget. The bailout, the cyclical losses on the downturn, continued war financing is going to bring entitlements and the tax code and everything into play. You already see Pete Peterson and other financiers circling their wagons talking about the need to do things in the out years. And there's just going to be a tremendous Donnybrook in our society. Who's going to save us with campaign contributions from Wall Street and the adverse feedback loop of them being able to protect themselves? I think Larry Lessig's speech was very timely this morning. Here's a little bit of early on in the top 20, that's what Barack had going on at the end of February. The numbers are much bigger now. And there's the Maverick. I have this horrible fantasy. I worked during the Keating Five on the Senate Banking Committee, and the idea that in the middle of this mess, we're going to hand one of the Keating Five the job of cleaning up the financial sector is just, that's almost laughable. This is a quote from a book, and I'll just go to the last line, and there's nothing more fatal for the life expectancy of the elite than to be viewed as ridiculous. Many of you who are Democrats have seen Alan Greenspan under the lens in recent times. This is an old picture of J.P. Morgan Jr. They put a midget on his lap during the Senate Banking Committee PCORA hearings and took this picture, which appeared on the front page all over the world as people tried to render him ridiculous for the financial practices of his firm at that time. No one is scapegoated to that degree, nor is it concentrated in their power. Recently in the New York Times, Robert Rubin came under a great deal of scrutiny in an article that is very, very stressful about his role vis-a-vis Citibank, where they talked about the downturn and analysts saying, where was he? Because he's viewed kind of as the Yoda of the financial sector. He responded to an interview, and I just put 3 clips in here where he says, in essence, I don't think it was my fault. And another guy who speaks off the record says, well, he was like the Wizard of Oz, and he was the guy that made all the decisions, and the last line has to do with how much money he got paid. Now, William Greider's a good friend of mine, and he's done some extensive interviews you can find on the Nation's website with Bob Rubin, and I don't pick on him because I think he's the worst animal, but he is in a position right now, a very prestigious man, where an awful lot is at risk, and I wonder about his and other people's judgment in terms of guiding our future candidates, particularly President Obama. And I think he's an earnest man. I don't think Alan Greenspan or he or Larry Summers or anybody were trying to mess up the system. But these are there's a lot of weight on their shoulders. And when I said this at lunchtime, Alex Gibney, my good friend and filmmaker, said to me, well, Rob, you should put some more music in this thing. You should put Sympathy for the Devil as the backing track to this slide. But he's been on the dark side for too long, so I rejected that notion. I worry less about individuals than I worry about the tyranny of ideas. I see Stephen Fraser talks about the different types of people that we have, and finance kind of archetypes, and Robert Pirsig talks about the aristocratic myths and the cowboy myths that inform the things that are attractive to our society. There are some structural myths. You know, the old saying, markets are efficient. Reminds me of the two Chicago school economists. They're walking down the street. One of them looks at him and says, hey, is that a $50 bill over there on the floor? And he says, no, if it was, somebody already would have picked it up. The notion that financiers are prescient or wise, I find this frightening because I've been one and hung around them, and I don't think like that. That market outcomes are impersonal and inevitable, these are human creations. That's a fallacy. Or that finance is too complex for people to understand. There's too much leverage, there's too much complexity, there's too much government assistance. It's not that complicated. The Horatio Alger myth, the right wing has used this as an elixir to attract you all. You work hard, you can be self-sufficient. Well, there are an awful lot of hard-working, well-meaning people going to get their house taken out of their hands right now because of how somebody in some other corner of the economy was playing funny. So I don't think that one's going to last very long. And the idea that the government has no role, that like the private and public sector are separate, while we're begging sovereign wealth funds all over the world to come and buy our banks and we won't nationalize them ourselves. I find that an interesting contradiction. This is Paul Krugman's chart, which I think is a pretty substantial indictment. The idea of all this deregulation in this regime has been wonderful, except that during the New Deal period, when we had compartmentalized finance, we had higher productivity growth than we've had in the subsequent period. I think that's worthy of an argument. I put this slide in for you, Jennifer, because I heard you singing it, so I just snapped it up there. But when I tried to put the Sam Cooke music in, it wouldn't work. Like I had a technical malfunction, and you know what the problem was? The problem was Sam Cooke's ghost heard how well you did that song, and he wouldn't let me put it in here. He didn't want to get embarrassed. But I think we are in a time now where we're going to have some real tension. We're going to have some real pain. These guys are still doing well because they're pretending the state's separate from the private sector, and so there's all kinds of feeding at the trough. And we've got a handful of things here that are reforms I'd be happy to talk to anybody about. Once again, Larry Lessig gets the red line. Public financing of elections would make this work a lot better. So I look at the progressive attitude towards finance that you saw the slide. Well, I pulled back the zoom lens with Alex Gibney. But I want to remind you that the guy talking right now on the stage, if you look at his resume, he's also been a financier, and he propagates myths too. In fact, Professor Doug Melton at Harvard has shown that the myth of the frog in the boiling water is not true. That if you start to raise the water temperature on the frog, he will jump out of the water. So that's nonsense. And I guess what I would say is I expect you all to jump out of the water too, because the pain and the temperature is rising really quickly. So at any rate, we'll let Glenn Ansard finish the conversation for us with a little bit of music.